The road that led Lady Eleanor to Blackthorn Manor had grown steadily more desolate as the carriage pressed forward. The journey from her family's estate had taken days, each mile carrying her further from the light-filled rooms and familiar gardens of her girlhood into a landscape stripped of warmth. The wheels sank into the spring mud with a stubborn heaviness, every turn of the horse's hooves splattering the lower panels of the coach with damp earth. Rain had passed only hours before, and the scent of wet soil mingled with the resinous breath of dark pines that lined the last stretch of road. When at last the carriage rounded a bend, the manor revealed itself on a rise above the valley. Its walls loomed grey against a sky layered with iron clouds, towers and battlements outlined in the dull light of late afternoon. Ivy clung to the stone as though it had been trying for centuries to soften the sharpness of the architecture, but the vines only deepened the sense of age and severity. Eleanor pressed her gloved hand against the window glass, her reflection pale against the looming silhouette. It was not the warm welcome of a home prepared for joy, but the fortress-like presence of a place heavy with history. Her heart beat unevenly beneath the confines of her traveling gown. She reminded herself that this was the day her parents had spoken of since her earliest years. She had been promised, almost from the cradle, to Lord Henry, the Earl of Wycliffe, whose family's lands and titles secured their own house's standing. She had accepted the arrangement as a duty, telling herself that affection could be learned if it did not arrive naturally. She had been educated to fulfill such a role, to play the harpsichord with elegance, to recite poetry with clarity, to manage a household with dignity. Now all that she had been taught would be tested against the cold weight of reality. The carriage drew up to the broad front steps, and the great doors of the manor opened with mechanical precision. Servants in sober livery hurried down the stairs, their movements brisk and wordless. Eleanor descended, her skirts brushing damp stone, and felt the chill rise from the ground through her shoes. The air smelled faintly of smoke from unseen hearths, yet it did little to dispel the raw dampness of the early evening. Lord Henry awaited her just beyond the threshold. He was tall, with a posture as rigid as the walls around him, his powdered wig immaculate, his coat dark and unadorned, save for the restrained glimmer of silver buttons. His expression conveyed neither joy nor surprise, but rather the steady calm of a man fulfilling an obligation. He bowed, offered his hand, and led her inside with courtesy that lacked the smallest trace of warmth. Eleanor lowered her gaze and followed, telling herself that this was the manner of noblemen, that tenderness was not to be expected in public. The interior of the manor was vast and dim, lit by scattered candelabra that barely reached the shadowed ceilings. Portraits lined the hall, stern faces of ancestors staring down with the severity of centuries past. The floors gleamed with polish, yet the air was heavy with the scent of age, beeswax, old wood, and the faint trace of damp that no fire could chase away. The servants guided her luggage upstairs as Henry escorted her through the main corridor, pointing out galleries, salons, and chambers with an air of rehearsed precision. His voice was measured, as though he recited a list for her benefit, rather than speaking of his home. Eleanor answered politely, her thoughts inward. She compared the echoing silence of these halls to the bright drawing rooms she had left behind. At her family's estate, laughter and conversation had carried through the corridors, doors left half open, windows thrown wide to admit the breeze. Here, the walls themselves seemed to discourage sound, and every step echoed like a trespass. The weight of stone pressed against her senses until she felt her breath shortened. At last, she was shown to her chamber, a vast room with a canopied bed and heavy curtains drawn against the dusk. A fire burned low in the hearth, its embers crackling faintly. Eleanor dismissed her maid for the evening, wishing for a moment alone to gather her thoughts. She crossed to the window, pulling aside the curtain with a hand that trembled slightly. The view opened upon the courtyard below, and beyond it, the darkened outline of the stables. The rain-soaked ground reflected the last light of day, the puddles gleaming like broken mirrors. For a time she saw nothing but the wavering shadows of torchlight. Then suddenly, a figure appeared astride a horse at the far edge of the yard. The man sat with a posture wholly unlike Henry's, looser, yet marked by a defiant strength. His clothing was plain, lacking the polish of nobility, but there was nothing uncertain in his stance. Though the distance and the failing light veiled his features, Eleanor felt the intensity of his gaze as though it pierced the dusk. The horse shifted, its breath rising like mist, and still he sat, silent, facing the house with an air of challenge. The sight unsettled her more deeply than the silence of the halls or the cold courtesy of her betrothed.
She could not have explained why, but her heart quickened, and she drew back from the window. In the corridor beyond her chamber, she heard the faint murmur of servants, their voices lowered to a conspiratorial hush. Only fragments carried through the heavy door, but she caught the words illegitimate and brother. The rest was lost to distance, yet the meaning struck sharp in her mind.
She turned again to the window, her hand gripping the curtain tightly, compelled to look once more toward the shadowed stables. The rider had not moved, his presence as unyielding as the manor itself. A chill ran down her spine, and she could not shake the sense that his watchful silence was not chance, but a force that would not be ignored. The first days within Blackthorn Manor moved forward, with a rhythm as rigid as the stone walls themselves. Eleanor awoke each morning to the sound of servants bustling outside her chamber door, their footsteps carrying trays of bread and watered wine, their whispers clipped and brief. When she descended to the breakfast room, Lord Henry was already seated, his posture faultless, his wig powdered to perfection, his expression calm to the point of stillness. He asked after her comfort, yet his words carried no softness, only the formal inquiry of duty fulfilled. After breakfast, he guided her through the estate, not as a man unveiling a beloved home, but as one presenting an inheritance of weight. They passed along corridors lined with ancestral portraits, their painted eyes stern and unsmiling. He paused before each canvas, naming fathers and uncles, recounting military campaigns, parliamentary achievements, and alliances secured through marriage. The tapestry of his lineage stretched backward through centuries, a legacy of unbroken power. Eleanor listened with courtesy, her lips shaping polite murmurs, though in her heart she felt as though she were being shown not a home, but a history in which she was expected to serve as another silent figure. Henry's conversation revealed little of his own heart. He spoke of tenants and rents, of boundaries between estates, of new agreements that would strengthen the family's influence. He remarked upon her future role as mistress of the household, her responsibility to maintain dignity, her duty to preserve the honor of Wycliffe blood. Rarely did his eyes soften, rarely did his voice shift from its measured cadence. The formality of his manner placed a gulf between them, one that no amount of ancestral pride could bridge. By afternoon, Eleanor often found herself alone. Henry vanished into the study, where correspondence and estate ledgers consumed his attention. Servants carried trays of ink and parchment, their eyes lowered, their mouths silent. In the great rooms, Eleanor wandered past marble busts and dark oil paintings, the echo of her footsteps following her like an accusation. The silence pressed upon her, until she longed for the sound of laughter, for music, for anything to chase away the sense of being a guest within her own future. It was during one of these solitary walks that she noticed the change in the servant's demeanor. When she asked simple questions, where the path led or what season the roses bloomed, their answers came quickly, their eyes flickering away, as though fearing their words might reveal too much. If she lingered near the servant's wing, the sound of conversation ceased abruptly, replaced by the hurried shuffle of feet. She began to sense that her presence carried with it an unease, though no one dared explain. Whispers reached her nonetheless. Passing two maids in the corridor, she heard the hushed tone of one saying, "The other one," before the pair scattered, cheeks flushed, eyes lowered. On another occasion she glimpsed a gardener crossing the courtyard, his head bowed, muttering the name Thomas beneath his breath, as though speaking of a forbidden subject. Though no one offered details, the fragments gathered in her mind like pieces of a puzzle, forming a shape she could not yet see clearly. Henry did not speak of it. His silence on the matter only deepened the mystery. Yet when Eleanor walked the gardens, she could not escape the sense of being observed. It was not the formal, restrained gaze of her betrothed, but something far stronger, more piercing. In the rustle of branches, in the pause of her breath, in the sudden stillness of the air, she felt it. Someone watching, unseen, yet undeniable. One afternoon, while walking along the orchard path, her shoes brushing against damp grass, she bent to lift her gown away from the mud. When she raised her eyes, she saw him. Across the orchard, partly veiled by the shade of twisted apple trees, stood a man. His hair was dark, his clothing plain, his figure taut with the strength of one accustomed to labor rather than ceremony. His posture was proud, his gaze steady, and though the distance lay between them, Eleanor felt it strike her with the force of a confession unspoken. She froze, her breath halting, her hand still gripping the fabric of her gown. The world around her seemed to still, the leaves ceasing their movement, the air heavy with a silence that belonged only to that moment. He did not approach, nor did he turn away. He stood, watching, as though bound to her by something neither of them could deny. Her heart pounded against her ribs, confusion mingling with a current of fear and fascination she could not control. At last she gathered her skirts and turned back toward the house, her steps quick, though her composure remained outwardly calm. The weight of his gaze followed her until she passed through the door, and even then it lingered, refusing to release her. That evening, when she retired to her chamber, the fire glowed low and the window curtain stirred faintly with the wind. She moved to close it, her hand still unsettled by the memory of the orchard. As she reached for the latch, her eyes fell upon something resting upon the sill. It was a flower, freshly cut, its petals unbruised, its fragrance strong. No servant had entered without her knowledge. No hand had left it there but one that moved unseen. She lifted it slowly, her heart trembling with both wonder and dread, knowing it could not have come from Henry. The silence of the manor grew heavier with each passing day, broken only by the occasional creak of old beams or the distant echo of footsteps on stone. Eleanor felt its weight settle around her like an invisible cloak. The flower upon her sill remained hidden within the folds of her writing desk, concealed from the eyes of servants, and above all, from Lord Henry. Its fragrance had faded, but the memory of how it came to her window lingered with a force she could not shake. In the corridors, the whispers that had once fallen silent when she approached now grew bolder, though still careful. She caught glances exchanged between the maids, eyes darting toward her, then toward the darker wings of the house. When she asked about the gardens or the orchards, the answers carried hesitation, as if every word held a hidden edge. The air in those halls seemed alive with murmurs of things unsaid, secrets that clung to the stone walls as stubbornly as ivy. Henry's presence provided little comfort. At supper, he sat across from her, the candles casting long shadows upon the table, his conversation clipped and precise. He asked whether she had seen the portraits in the West Gallery, whether she found her chamber adequate, whether she was satisfied with the meals prepared for her. Each inquiry seemed more a duty than an expression of genuine care. His gaze often wandered from her, returning to the papers brought to him even during their meals. Eleanor, in turn, nodded politely, though her mind drifted elsewhere. The flower haunted her thoughts. With it came the memory of the orchard, the dark figure half veiled by branches, the strength in his posture, the intensity of his stare. She could not deny that the gaze had pierced her more deeply than Henry's measured civility ever had. Yet with that recognition came a shiver of fear, for she knew instinctively that his presence carried danger. It was not long before she noticed the pattern. Each evening, as dusk fell, her steps led her toward the back staircases, the quietest corridors, the windows that overlooked the courtyard or the stables. She told herself she merely wished for air, for light, for something beyond the suffocating stillness of her chamber. But in truth she sought a glimpse of that shadowed presence. a confirmation that what she had seen was not imagination. The servant's whispers grew sharper. Passing through the linen corridor, she heard two women pause mid-conversation, one muttering the word "brother" in a tone heavy with warning, before both lowered their eyes at her approach. In the scullery, she glimpsed a boy who darted away when she entered, as though fearing to be caught speaking of what should remain hidden. Every silence, every averted glance, only deepened her conviction that she stood on the edge of a secret neither spoken nor safe. One morning, while descending the back staircase, Eleanor turned a corner and stopped short. There, in the dim space where the candlelight faltered, stood the very figure that had haunted her thoughts. Thomas. He did not move, did not speak, yet his presence filled the narrow passage with an intensity that robbed her of breath. His eyes locked upon hers, dark, unyielding, unreadable, and for a heartbeat too long, time itself seemed suspended. Then, without a word, he turned and vanished into the shadows, his footsteps swallowed by the stone. Eleanor clutched the railing, her heart racing, her thoughts in disarray. She knew with certainty now that he was no ghost of her imagination, but a living force within the house, a man whose very existence unsettled the careful order Henry imposed. The hours that followed passed in a haze. At supper, Henry's voice droned on about tenant disputes and estate accounts, his words falling upon Eleanor's ears like meaningless notes. Her mind returned again and again to the shadowed stairwell, to the silent confrontation that had spoken more than words could. She felt the ground beneath her shifting, as though the house itself concealed a current too strong for her to resist. That night, unable to sleep, Eleanor paced her chamber. The moon cast a pale glow through the window, illuminating the courtyard below. She pressed her palm against the cold glass, listening to the silence of the manor. Then came the sound, shouts, sharp and urgent, echoing across the stone. She flung the curtain wide. In the courtyard, torches flared, their light dancing wildly against the dark. Henry stood with servants gathered around, his voice raised in command, the stern authority of a master whose control must not falter. Yet the true focus of the chaos stood apart. Thomas, his figure lit in flashes as he struggled with a horse gone wild. The animal reared, hooves striking the air, but Thomas held fast, his strength evident in every taut line of his body. For a breathless moment, Eleanor watched him wrestle the beast into submission, his defiance a challenge not only to the animal but to the order Henry sought to impose. As the horse stilled beneath his hand, Thomas lifted his gaze. Torchlight caught his face, and his eyes found hers in the window above. Her breath faltered, for in that look burned something neither silence nor distance could conceal. The announcement of the ball came with the formality of an edict. Lord Henry informed Eleanor at breakfast, his voice steady, his manner composed, as though the decision had already been carved into the stone of the manor itself. He declared it necessary to present her to society not merely as his guest, but as his promised wife, the future Countess of Wycliffe. The words were not an invitation, nor even a discussion. They were an instruction, an act of duty imposed upon her without question. From that moment, the household prepared with restless urgency. Servants hurried through corridors carrying candelabra, polishing silver until it gleamed, and unrolling carpets across the cold floors of the great hall. The air filled with the scent of wax and wine, mingled with the faint smoke from countless hearths kindled to warm the cavernous rooms. Eleanor watched this tide of activity with a heart that beat unevenly, for she understood that the ball would place her life upon display. Every guest would look upon her as Henry's possession. Every bow and curtsy, a reinforcement of the contract that bound her. On the day itself, Eleanor was dressed in silk the color of ivory, her gown heavy with the weight of brocade, her hair arranged with precision. The mirror showed her a figure worthy of admiration, yet her eyes betrayed unease, and the flush upon her cheeks came not from joy but from the pressure of expectation. As the hour of evening approached, the sound of wheels and hooves echoed against the manor walls. Carriages arrived in procession, each bearing noble guests whose names carried power and influence. The great hall, when filled, blazed with light. Chandeliers dripped with candles, their glow reflected in gilt mirrors. Musicians played from the gallery above, their strings weaving patterns of elegance. The room swelled with gowns of silk, velvet coats, powdered wigs, and jeweled fans. The air shimmered with perfume and wine, with the low murmur of conversation rising and falling like a tide. Eleanor, standing at Henry's side, felt herself an ornament set upon a pedestal, her smile arranged, her posture unyielding. Henry received his guests with the courtesy of a man fulfilling his duty, introducing Eleanor as though she were a finely wrought treasure. Words of admiration surrounded her grace, her beauty, her good fortune. Yet beneath the surface she detected the sharper edge of calculation. The men spoke of dowries and lands. The women measured her with eyes that sought weakness. The elderly nodded with satisfaction at the alliance confirmed by her presence. It was as if her heart did not exist, only her value. As she moved through the hall, the press of admiration grew suffocating. Every word seemed to remind her that she was here not as herself, but as a promise, a contract, a vessel for legacy. She longed for a single breath of air untainted by expectation. Yet the walls offered no escape, and Henry's hand upon hers was a weight that bound her more securely than chains. But even in the midst of the glittering throng, Eleanor felt it again. That other gaze, sharp as flint, cutting through the haze of admiration. Her eyes, against her will, sought its source. And there, beyond the circle of gilded guests, half hidden in the shadowed gallery above, she saw him. Thomas. He was not dressed for the occasion, nor welcomed among the assembly, but he stood nonetheless, his presence defiant, his eyes fixed upon her with a fire that no one else dared display. The music swelled, couples moved to the floor, silk skirts sweeping, heels striking polished wood in rhythm. Eleanor moved as expected, her hand in Henry's, her face composed, her body executing every step she had been trained to master. Yet each turn of the dance, each note of music, felt hollow beside the awareness of that figure in the shadows. The air seemed to thrum with a silent challenge that no one else perceived, as though every glance he cast burned itself upon her skin. When the dance ended, Henry guided her to the dais where a table had been set for the hosts. He lifted his glass, his voice carrying across the hall, announcing with solemn authority the union that would soon be sealed. The crowd answered with applause, the sound of approval rising like a tide of inevitability. Eleanor inclined her head, her smile measured, her heart trembling. But in the instant her eyes lifted from the glittering company, she found him again. Thomas, still in the gallery, his expression carved from iron, his jaw set, his eyes locked upon her with a force that made her breath falter. The applause faded around her, muffled and distant, for in that gaze lay something far stronger than duty, something that struck her with the certainty of a storm yet to come. The days after the ball unfolded with a peculiar slowness, as though the manor itself were holding its breath. The great hall, so recently filled with music and the rustle of silk, now lay silent, its chandeliers extinguished, its polished floors echoing only with the steps of servants clearing away the remnants of festivity. Yet within Eleanor's chest, a different rhythm pulsed, quick and restless, refusing to quiet. Henry had resumed his routine with undisturbed composure. He returned to his study, spending long hours with correspondence and accounts, as though the ball had been nothing more than a task completed, another entry in his ledger of obligations. When he appeared for meals, his conversation turned once again to matters of land and lineage. His questions to Eleanor were brief, his tone polite, yet detached. He neither noticed nor cared for the shadows beneath her eyes, or the way her hands trembled when she lifted her wine. Left to herself, Eleanor's footsteps carried her with growing frequency toward the places where silence lingered, gardens untended since the rains, the ruined fountain at the edge of the lawn, the orchard heavy with the scent of damp earth. She told herself that she walked there for air, for solitude, for the freedom denied her within the manor's walls. Yet her heart betrayed her, for she knew she sought more than solitude. She sought him. It was in the stables first that she caught sight of him again. Thomas stood with his back half-turned, his shirt sleeves rolled, his movements steady as he brushed a restless horse. The air smelled of hay and leather, and the low sound of his voice reached her, soothing the animal with a quiet firmness. He did not look at her, yet she felt the awareness of her presence vibrate through the space like a chord struck upon a string. She remained at the threshold for only a moment before retreating, her breath uneven, her heart caught between fear and longing. The following day, as she walked near the orchard, her gaze strayed between the trees, searching without admitting she searched. A sudden shift of shadow revealed him once more, leaning against a trunk, his arms crossed, his eyes fixed upon her with a calm intensity that rooted her to the path. Neither spoke. The air between them seemed charged, as though the orchard itself held its breath. When she turned away, her legs carried her swiftly back to the manor, but the echo of his gaze followed her, clinging like the scent of blossoms in the folds of her gown. Henry's neglect only deepened the turmoil. At supper, he spoke of his desire to extend the estate's boundaries, of agreements to be settled, of names Eleanor scarcely knew. He did not notice when her fork lay untouched beside her plate, or when her eyes drifted toward the darkened windows. His voice was steady, his presence cold, his role as betrothed reduced to formality. Each evening, she dined in silence that stretched unbearably, broken only by the clatter of utensils and the low crackle of the hearth. One afternoon, clouds gathered thick over the horizon, and Eleanor, restless, strayed further into the gardens than she had yet dared. At the ruined fountain, where moss crept across the crumbling stone, she found him. Thomas was there, as though the storm had drawn him, his figure stark against the darkening sky. She halted, her breath caught, her pulse loud in her ears. He did not speak, nor did she. Yet the nearness was unbearable, charged with a force that seemed to draw them together while forbidding them to move. The first drops of rain struck the leaves, heavy and cold. In an instant, the sky opened, releasing a torrent that blurred the edges of the world. Eleanor turned, gathering her skirts, running back toward the house, her hair clinging to her temples, her gown soaked and heavy. She reached the safety of the manor breathless, her heart pounding not only from the storm, but from the knowledge that she had stood too close to the precipice of her own restraint. When night came, she returned to her chamber, the storm still thrumming against the windows. She closed the shutters, her hands trembling, her mind consumed by what had passed in the garden. As she turned toward the bed, her eyes caught on the window once more. There, upon the sill, lay another flower. This one was different. Its stem was bent, its petals bruised, as though it had been torn from the earth with a violence that mirrored the storm. She reached for it slowly, her hand hovering above the crushed bloom, the weight of unspoken meaning pressing down upon her. The days that followed pressed down upon Eleanor with a suffocating weight. The flower left on her sill, crushed and torn, remained hidden in the drawer of her writing desk, its bruised petals withering in silence. Yet the meaning of it lingered, dark and restless, refusing to release her mind. Every step she took within the manor seemed shadowed by suspicion. Every glance from a servant carried with it an edge sharper than before, as though eyes and ears throughout the house had grown keener. Eleanor's composure faltered under the scrutiny. She tried to move with the same calm grace she had been trained to uphold. Yet her hands trembled when she lifted her teacup, and her gaze slipped away too quickly when addressed. In the corridors, the whispering no longer ceased at her approach. Instead, voices lowered only slightly, their tones tinged with the certainty of knowing more than they dared say aloud. Henry noticed. Though slow to sense subtleties, he could not remain blind forever to the unease that rippled through his household. At supper, his eyes lingered upon her with an intensity colder than before, his questions more pointed. He asked why she wandered the gardens so often, why her cheeks bore the flush of exertion, why her appetite had dwindled. His tone was outwardly polite, yet beneath it simmered a restrained anger, as though he sought confirmation of a betrayal he dared not yet name. Eleanor could not answer with truth. She bowed her head, offered vague responses, and felt her throat tighten beneath the weight of his scrutiny. The meal passed in silence, broken only by the sound of knife upon plate, the low crackle of the fire, and the unspoken tension that filled the air between them. Later that evening, as she walked through the gallery, she found herself drawn to the windows. Outside, the courtyard lay washed in pale moonlight, the stones damp from a recent rain. She lingered there, her eyes roaming over the shadows cast by the stables. It was then that Henry entered, his footsteps sharp upon the wooden floor. He stopped behind her, and for a moment she felt his gaze upon her back. Slowly, his eyes followed the line of her own toward the courtyard. The silence thickened, unbearable. Eleanor's breath caught, for she knew what he must see. Below, in the open space of the yard, stood Thomas. His figure was clear in the moonlight, his stance proud, his face turned upward as though in open defiance. Eleanor's heart lurched in her chest. She tried to turn away, but it was too late. Henry's eyes hardened. Though he spoke no word, the truth was written upon his face, the truth of where her attention had strayed, of what her silence concealed. The humiliation struck him like a blow, though he masked it behind a stillness more dangerous than rage. He turned from the window with rigid composure, but the air between them froze, heavy with the knowledge that her loyalty was now in question. From that night forward, Henry's civility carried a new edge. His politeness became sharp, his words measured but cold. He no longer asked about her comfort without hidden meaning. Each inquiry seemed to press against her with suspicion. Eleanor felt her world contract. She could not walk the gardens without the quiet presence of a servant behind her. She could not pass through a corridor without sensing eyes upon her. Even her letters, once private, now passed through Henry's hands before they left the manor. Her chamber became a prison of velvet and wood. Though the fire burned, she felt the chill of confinement seep into her bones. The whispers of the servants, the silent watchfulness of Henry, the memory of Thomas's defiance, all pressed upon her until she scarcely knew whether the beating of her heart was her own, or the echo of footsteps closing in. And always, in the corners of her mind, lingered the image of Henry at the gallery window, his eyes fixed on Thomas below, the moment of discovery that had sealed her fate within the house. The atmosphere within Blackthorn Manor thickened until every breath Eleanor drew felt heavy with dread. The servants no longer bothered to hide their whispers. They paused in doorways, exchanging furtive glances, their voices carrying just enough for her to catch fragments. Her name, Thomas's name, words half swallowed, yet unmistakable. The scandal grew in the shadows like mold, unseen yet impossible to contain. Henry's demeanor sharpened with each passing day. He had ceased all pretense of gentility. When he addressed Eleanor, his words carried the clipped precision of command. He dictated the hours she might walk, the rooms she might enter, the company she might keep. A maid was assigned to her whenever she stepped beyond her chamber, a silent sentinel whose presence reminded her at every moment that her movements were no longer her own. Letters brought for her signature never reached her hands without first passing beneath Henry's eyes. He wrapped the fabric of control around her life as tightly as the walls of the manor themselves. The world beyond those walls sensed it. When carriages from neighboring estates rolled along the drive, the visitors arrived already aware of the rumors. Their eyes lingered too long upon Eleanor, their smiles carrying the sharp edge of concealed amusement. They whispered in corners when they thought themselves unobserved, their fans fluttering, their heads bent together. The scandal had spread, carried upon the wind faster than she could have imagined, and though no one spoke it aloud in her presence, she felt its sting with every glance cast her way. Eleanor tried to cling to composure. She sat with her hands folded, her posture perfect, her voice steady when addressed. Yet inside, her thoughts twisted upon themselves, circling endlessly between terror of discovery and the burning memory of Thomas's gaze. She felt herself pulled in two directions at once, toward the safety of obedience and the peril of desire. The struggle consumed her nights, leaving her restless, her face pale with sleeplessness when morning came. Henry grew colder still. He spoke of their marriage with finality, insisting that the date be hastened. His reasoning was delivered with icy logic. Only by sealing their union swiftly could the gossip be silenced. Eleanor heard the words as the sound of a door closing, of walls rising higher around her. She knew that his plan was not born of love, but of wounded pride, a desire to bind her before the whispers could wound him further. Yet the more tightly Henry sought to control her, the more violently her heart rebelled. Each restriction only deepened her hunger for air, for freedom, for the one presence within the manor who looked upon her not with ownership, but with fire. That longing burned against her reason, against her fear, until she could scarcely distinguish her own will from the force that drew her toward Thomas. One night, unable to bear the stillness of her chamber, she rose. The house slept in silence, the lamps dim, the corridors hushed. She wrapped her shawl close and moved with quiet steps through the hall, her slippered feet barely stirring the rug beneath her. Her pulse beat loud in her ears as she descended toward the lower rooms, her body carrying her forward, though her mind screamed with warning. The air near the stables was colder, the scent of hay and damp earth rising through the open doors. She took a step closer, her breath shallow, her hand brushing the wall for balance. Yet before she could move farther, the sound reached her. Footsteps, firm and deliberate, echoing against the stone floor of the corridor behind her. She froze where she stood, her body rigid, the shadows stretching long at her feet. The sound grew louder, nearer, each step announcing discovery. A shadow fell across the ground before her. It was Thomas. His figure emerged from the dim corridor, the torchlight catching the lines of his face, the intensity of his expression, the defiance that seemed to radiate from every step he took. Eleanor's breath caught, her body torn between the instinct to retreat and the deeper pull that had haunted her since the first moment she had seen him. He halted only a pace away, close enough that the silence between them trembled with all that remained unsaid. For one charged moment, the stillness held. The air seemed to press around them, heavy with unspoken confession, with desire too dangerous to name. Eleanor's heart pounded in her chest, her hand tightening on the folds of her shawl as though it were her last defense. Yet before the moment could break, another sound shattered the silence, a voice sharp with authority, echoing down the stairwell. Henry. His footsteps struck hard against the stone, his words slicing the air with suspicion. He descended quickly, his presence filling the space with cold command. Eleanor turned, her face pale, her body caught in the impossible position between the two brothers. The torchlight flickered, casting shifting shadows across the walls as Henry came into view. His eyes swept over the scene, narrowing as they settled first on Eleanor, then on Thomas. The tension that had simmered unspoken for so long now erupted. Henry's voice cut through the corridor, accusing, condemning. He hurled his words at Thomas with the force of long-suppressed resentment, branding him insolent, ungrateful, a stain upon the family name. His tone carried not only outrage at this moment, but the bitterness of years in which his authority had been silently defied. Thomas did not shrink from the assault. He stood his ground, his voice answering with fury of its own. He spoke of injustice, of years spent in the shadows, while Henry enjoyed every privilege of birth. His words were edged with contempt, yet behind them burned a rawness, the wound of exclusion that had never healed. The truth spilled into the open, unveiled before Eleanor with a violence that left no space for denial. She stood between them, the weight of their enmity pressing down upon her until her knees trembled. Henry's hand shot out, seizing her arm with a grip that left no question of possession. He declared her loyalty must remain unbroken, that her gaze must not wander, that she belonged to him alone. The force of his grasp sent a shiver of dread through her, yet before she could recoil, Thomas stepped forward. The air crackled as the two men faced one another, one with the rigid authority of a title, the other with the defiance of a man who had been denied his birthright yet refused to bow. Neither yielded, their wills colliding in a silence so sharp it seemed to hum in Eleanor's ears. She could feel the storm gathering, each heartbeat drawing them closer to a rupture that would not be contained. And then, from the edges of the corridor, figures began to appear. Servants, roused by the raised voices, gathered hesitantly, their eyes wide, their whispers quick. They pressed into the shadows, drawn by the spectacle, unable to look away. The secrecy that had cloaked the household for so long was gone. The truth now burned in open view, with witnesses enough to carry it beyond the walls. Eleanor's chest rose and fell with rapid breaths. She knew in that moment that nothing could be concealed again, that every future step would be shadowed by what had now been revealed. The manor woke to scandal it could no longer contain. The echoes of the confrontation in the corridor spread swiftly, carried on the tongues of servants and the startled glances of guests who had been within earshot. By morning, the whispers had escaped the house itself, travelling outward to the neighbouring estates. No wall of stone, no curtain of velvet could muffle the truth once it had been witnessed so plainly. Eleanor felt it in the way every gaze lingered upon her with questions unspoken, in the way every murmur ceased when she entered a room. Henry's pride had been wounded in the most public of ways. His composure, once his greatest armour, became the mask of his fury. He moved through the halls with the stride of a man who had been mocked before his own household. His words were cold, his silence colder still, yet beneath both lay a sharpened cruelty. At supper, he announced with deliberate clarity that there would be no delay, no further pretense of patience. Their marriage would take place at once, and by it, the house of Wycliffe would be secured against every rumour. His declaration rang through the dining room like a decree carved in stone. Eleanor lowered her eyes, yet her pulse thundered in her ears. The words pressed upon her chest like an iron weight. She understood that Henry's decision was not born of affection, nor even of duty, but of vengeance cloaked in respectability. By binding her to him swiftly, he sought to silence the whispers, to crush any thought that her heart had strayed. It was not her happiness he sought, but his own vindication. The days that followed were filled with preparations she had no hand in shaping. Servants bustled through corridors with bolts of cloth, with parcels of lace, with silver polished until it shone like mirrors. The chapel was readied, its pews dusted, its altar dressed with linen white as snow. Every candle, every ribbon, every flower spoke of a celebration. Yet to Eleanor they seemed the adornments of a prison, each gesture tightening the chains that bound her. Thomas did not vanish quietly. His fury at Henry burned too fiercely for retreat. The night after the confrontation, he sought her out in the stillness of the manor, finding her in a shadowed passage where no servant dared follow. His voice, low but trembling with intensity, confessed the torment that had driven him, the dangerous passion that had turned his every glance into a betrayal. He admitted that he had left the flowers, that he had watched her not to shame her but because he could not resist the pull of her presence. His words, raw and unguarded, fell upon her like sparks upon dry kindling. Eleanor's body shook with the force of his confession. She knew the peril, the ruin such sentiments carried, yet she could not deny that her heart had long understood what her lips dared not speak. The fire between them was real, undeniable, a truth that burned even as it threatened to destroy them both. But Thomas's plea did not end with admission. He begged her not to surrender herself to a loveless future, not to bend beneath Henry's will. He urged her to claim her own freedom, even if it meant defying the weight of society. His words planted themselves deep within her, rooting where fear and longing had already made fertile ground. When she returned to her chamber that night, Eleanor did not sleep. She sat by the window, the candle at her side burning low, her thoughts circling endlessly. Duty and desire, safety and ruin, obedience and truth. All warred within her until dawn broke grey and cold across the courtyard. By morning, the decision had not yet formed in words, but in her heart it pressed closer, heavier, until she knew it could not be avoided. She understood at last that her future no longer rested in Henry's hands, nor in the judgment of society, but in the courage of her own choice. The morning of the wedding arrived cloaked in a heavy stillness, as though the air itself resisted what was to take place. The bells of the chapel tolled in steady rhythm, their sound carrying across the damp fields, echoing against the stone of the manor. Eleanor rose from her bed, her gown laid before her like a symbol of surrender. The silk shimmered faintly in the pale light, white and unblemished, yet it felt to her as though it were woven from chains rather than cloth. Her hands trembled as she touched it, her heart caught in a storm that had raged too long. Servants moved about her with practiced efficiency, fastening the gown, smoothing the folds, arranging her veil. Their faces betrayed nothing, yet their eyes lingered with a weight she could not mistake. They knew the whispers. They had seen the looks, and now they prepared her for a union that carried the chill of compulsion rather than joy. Eleanor lifted her chin, steadying her breath, forcing herself into the composure that had been expected of her since childhood. When she stepped into the corridor, the silence pressed harder. The manor's walls, ancient and unyielding, seemed to close about her with finality. Henry waited in the chapel, his pride sharpened into armor, his determination set as stone. Every step Eleanor took toward that altar felt as though it carried her further from herself, further into a life carved not by love, but by obligation. The chapel was filled, though the air inside was thick with unease. Guests whispered behind gloved hands, their fans stirring like restless wings. The candles upon the altar burned high, their flames flickering in the draught, casting long shadows upon the stone floor. At the front, Henry stood tall, immaculate in his coat, his expression a mask of composure that concealed the fury beneath. His eyes flickered toward her as she entered, hard and unyielding, a silent command that she approach. Eleanor's steps echoed in the silence, the train of her gown sweeping across the aisle. She lifted her eyes to the altar, her heart pounding louder than the bells, louder than the murmurs of the crowd. For a moment, the weight of duty pressed so heavily upon her that she nearly faltered. She saw the years stretched before her, cold dinners, silent halls, the suffocation of a union forged in pride rather than love. Her chest tightened, and she knew she could not, would not, surrender to such a fate. The officiant began the words of ceremony, his voice steady, his tone carrying through the hushed chapel. Eleanor's hands shook within her gloves, the lace damp against her palms. The moment approached when she would be called to speak, to bind herself with vows she could never honor in truth. She closed her eyes, a breath trembling from her lips, and in that breath she found her courage. When the moment came, she did not lower her head in obedience. She lifted it, her voice clear, stronger than she believed herself capable of. She declared before them all that she could not enter into a union without love, that to do so would be to betray not only herself, but the very truth of what marriage should mean. Her words fell like a stone into a still pond, breaking the silence, sending ripples of shock through the gathered assembly. Gasps rose from the pews, fans stilled mid-motion, whispers surged like a sudden wind. Henry's composure shattered in an instant, his face flushing with rage, his lips tightening as he struggled to master himself before so many eyes. Yet Eleanor did not waver. She stood tall in her gown, her voice carrying with steady conviction, her choice laid bare for all to hear. For a heartbeat, the chapel held its breath. Then, from the shadows near the back, a figure stepped forward. Thomas. His presence was a defiance of every law of propriety, yet he moved with the certainty of a man who no longer cared for such laws. His gaze fixed upon Eleanor, unflinching, unashamed, his stride carrying him toward her with each step an open declaration. The guests murmured louder, scandal rippling through the hall, but Eleanor's heart soared as though the very air had broken free within her chest. He reached her side, and though no words passed between them, The truth was clear. Henry's fury darkened the air, his fists clenched, his pride wounded beyond repair, yet Thomas did not falter. He stood beside Eleanor as though he had been meant for that place all along, his presence both shield and promise. Eleanor's hand, trembling still, found his, and the contact was a release, a liberation, a vow stronger than any uttered by ceremony. The officiant's words faltered, lost amidst the uproar. Guests turned, some with outrage, others with awe, all with the certainty that they were witnessing a moment that would be spoken of for years. Yet Eleanor did not hear their whispers, nor did she see their stares. She felt only the steady warmth of Thomas's hand, the strength of his presence, the freedom in her own choice. Together they turned from the altar, moving down the aisle, not as fugitives, but as victors, their steps carrying them past rows of faces frozen in disbelief. The great doors of the chapel swung wide, and they stepped into the open air. The bells still tolled, but their sound no longer weighed heavy. It rang with the clarity of triumph, a chorus to the choice she had made. The sky stretched wide above them, the clouds parting to reveal a sudden brightness, as though even the heavens acknowledged what had been done. Eleanor's veil lifted in the breeze, her gown trailing like a banner of defiance. She drew in a breath of air, free and unchained, and for the first time since her arrival at Blackthorn Manor, she felt wholly alive. They left the manor behind, far from the stone walls and their shadows, in a quiet place removed from the eyes of scandal. They were wed. The ceremony was simple, stripped of grandeur, witnessed only by those few who would not betray them. No jewels adorned Eleanor's gown, no towering chandeliers lit their vows. Instead, the sun itself cast its light upon them, the wind carried their words, the earth stood as their witness. Thomas spoke with the rawness of truth, his voice unadorned by formality, yet filled with reverence. Eleanor answered with steady conviction, her heart laid bare. Their vows were not forged of duty, but of choice, not bound by power, but by love. When their hands joined, it was not a contract sealed, but a life begun, their union no longer forbidden, but embraced. In that moment, the chains of expectation shattered. The whispers of scandal could not touch them, for they had chosen truth over pretense, courage over fear. Eleanor's smile carried the light of freedom, her eyes no longer veiled with hesitation. Thomas's gaze, once shadowed by bitterness, softened with the clarity of a man who had at last claimed both love and dignity. Their life began not in grandeur, but in simplicity, and in that simplicity lay its beauty. No longer confined by the cold formality of Henry's halls, they walked forward together into a future of their own making. Love had triumphed over pride, truth over silence, freedom over chains. Eleanor had come to Blackthorn Manor bound by duty, her life shaped by the will of others. She left it hand in hand with Thomas, her heart her own, her future chosen. And in that choice lay the message that would outlast scandal and whispers alike, that no soul should live in chains, that love is the truest freedom, that courage is the only path to happiness. Thank you so much for listening to this story all the way to the end. We hope it moved you as much as it moved us while telling it. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave us a comment telling us where you're listening from and what you liked the most. Rate this story from 0 to 10. What score would you give it? If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave a like as a show of support. That really motivates us to keep creating and sharing more stories full of emotion and life lessons. And before we go, we want to remind you that an exciting and heartwarming story recommendation will appear on the final screen. If you'd like to enjoy it, just click on the video. Thank you once again for being here, and we'll see you in the next story.